On a winter afternoon at Grand Central Terminal in New York City, amid the rushing crowds spilling through the Great Hall beneath its warm golden light, a 3-year-old boy sat quietly at the corner of a long wooden bench. He held a worn gray teddy bear against his chest, his small hands gripping it as if the bear were the only thing left in the world that still belonged to him. He was not crying. He was not calling out. He simply sat there, his gray eyes never leaving the western entrance, as though his mother might walk through those doors at any moment. Beside him were only 2 things: a small canvas backpack with the name Noah scrawled across it in blue crayon, and a folded note tucked under the teddy bear's arm. On that note, hurried lines had been written in ink that had already begun to smudge. "Please take care of him. I will come back. I promise." People walked past. No one stopped. Then a black Bentley pulled up to the curb outside the terminal. The door opened. The man who stepped out wore a tailored black suit, a crisp white collar, and silver-streaked hair combed neatly back his gray eyes so sharp that the crowd parted around him without being asked. His name was Alessandro Moretti, 38 years old, the most powerful boss of the Moretti family in all of New York City, a man who had never flinched before a gun barrel, before negotiations that ended in blood behind closed doors, before names that even the FBI dared only to whisper. He had just come from his father's grave, the cemetery 2 blocks from the station, on the 16th anniversary of the day his father had been shot dead in front of him when Alessandro was only 22. He was supposed to walk straight through the main hall to the eastern platform, but when his eyes accidentally passed over that wooden bench, he stopped, not because of an abandoned child in a crowded terminal that was a sight he had seen more times than he wanted to remember, but because of the boy's face, the boy's features, the straight bridge of the nose, the line of the jaw, and above all, those steel-gray eyes resembled Alessandro to a frightening degree, as if a photograph of himself at 3 years old had stepped out of its old frame in the library of the Moretti estate and come to sit here, holding a teddy bear, waiting for someone who would never arrive in time. The man who had once stared down the barrel of a gun without blinking felt something shift inside his chest, a nearness he could not name, a recognition he had no memory for. Alessandro could have walked on. He could have called the police and disappeared into the crowd. That was what a man like him had been trained to do for 20 years. He did not. He walked slowly forward, and then he did something no one in the Moretti organization had ever seen him do for anyone. He knelt down on one knee before the wooden bench, until his eyes were level with the boy's. The boy looked back. He did not blink much. He held the gray teddy bear a little tighter, but he did not shrink away. "What is your name?" Alessandro asked. It was the smallest voice he had used in 20 years. "Noah," the boy answered. Then, as though clarifying something important, he added, "I am waiting for my mommy." Alessandro did not answer. He did not want to give the boy a lie, and he did not want to give him a truth. Not yet, not this one. A voice broke the silence behind him. "Sir," a station employee had approached a woman in her 40s, name tag reading Diana, eyes tired in the way people who worked winter shifts at Grand Central grew tired. "He has been sitting there almost 2 hours. We checked the cameras." A woman in a brown coat set him down and walked out through the western entrance. She did not look back. We were about to call it in. Alessandro nodded once, without turning. "Wait." He reached out and took the folded note from beneath the teddy bear's arm. He had already read it once. He read it again now, slower. "Please take care of him. I will come back. I promise." The ink had smudged where a small palm had rested on it. A child's palm. Something in his chest turned sideways. Inside the breast pocket of his suit, the weight of his father's pocket watch pressed against his ribs the way it always did, steady, old, familiar, but tonight it felt heavier, as if the watch itself were listening. He rose. He did not call the police. He called his lawyer. Diana watched as the man in the black suit stepped a few paces away and spoke in a low, measured voice into a phone that had no visible screen. 30 minutes later, a second man in a gray overcoat arrived through the eastern entrance carrying a leather portfolio. Papers were opened on a marble ledge. A pen appeared. Signatures were placed with the practiced calm of a man who had signed many things that mattered. An emergency guardianship provisional, temporary, valid for 72 hours. Enough time to bring the boy somewhere warm. Enough time to keep him out of a system that swallowed children like Noah and returned them changed. Diana was given a card. She was told someone would call her tomorrow. She looked at the card, looked at the boy, and nodded slowly. Because there are men in this world who make refusal an unwise choice. Alessandro returned to the bench. He bent down and lifted Noah into his arms. The boy did not resist. He did not stiffen. He simply shifted the teddy bear to make room, laid his cheek against the black lapel of Alessandro's coat, and looked up. "Are you taking me to my mommy?" he asked, so quietly that only the man carrying him could hear. Alessandro opened his mouth. He closed it again. For 20 years, he had lied to senators, prosecutors, priests, and once to his own confessor. He had lied to men holding guns to his head. He had never once flinched. He could not lie to this child. He walked toward the eastern doors with the boy in his arms, and he said nothing at all because a silence, at least, was not a lie a 3-year-old could be broken by. Outside, the Bentley was still waiting. Snow had begun to fall in slow, unhurried flakes. The driver opened the rear door without a word. Alessandro settled Noah onto the seat beside him and fastened the belt with hands that had, only that afternoon, laid white lilies on a grave. He looked down at the small figure now buckled against black leather, still holding the worn gray bear, still watching him with an unreadable patience. Then the Bentley pulled away from the curb, and Grand Central Terminal began to shrink behind them into the winter dusk. The road ahead led east over the bridge, toward Long Island, toward a house that had not held the sound of a child's voice in 20 years. The Bentley crossed the bridge in silence. Snow settled on the windshield in patient, unhurried flakes, and the driver did not once glance in the rearview mirror. In the back seat, the boy had stopped watching the city lights and had begun watching the man beside him instead. Not with fear, not with curiosity, with the calm, careful attention of a child who was memorizing a face he did not yet trust to remember him. Alessandro noticed. He did not look back. By the time the estate gates rolled open, Noah had fallen asleep against the black leather, the gray teddy bear tucked beneath his chin. The driveway curved through a stand of leafless oaks and opened onto a house that had not smelled of anything but coffee, tobacco, and gun oil in 20 years. Marco Bellini was waiting at the top of the front steps. He had been the second man through every door Alessandro had ever walked through for 15 years. Broad shoulders, close-cropped dark hair, a coat that never quite hid the shape of the weapon beneath it. Around his neck hung a small silver cross on a plain chain, the only piece of jewelry Marco had ever worn every day since he was 14 years old, since the afternoon a bullet meant for Vittorio Moretti had gone through his own father's chest instead. Marco had opened the front door of the estate at this hour 10,000 times. He had never opened it to find Alessandro Moretti stepping out of the Bentley with a sleeping child in his arms. He did not speak. He did not move for a full second. Then, because he was Marco, he simply held the door wider and said, "Inside, before the cold gets him." Alessandro walked past him without stopping. In the second-floor guest wing, Bernie Halloran was already turning down a bed, 60 years old, silver-haired, straight-backed, dressed in the same dark waistcoat he had worn to serve Vittorio Moretti 2 decades ago, and Alessandro every day since. He had heard the gate open. He had asked no questions. By the time Alessandro reached the top of the stairs, there was a warm bath running in the adjoining room, a folded, child-sized robe on the chair that no child had ever sat in, and a small tray of tomato soup already on the sideboard. "How?" Alessandro said quietly. "I keep the guest wing ready, sir." Bernie did not look up. One never knows. His hands were steady as he smoothed the coverlet. His face gave nothing away. Noah did not cry when the bath came. He did not cry when the robe went on. He ate half the bowl of tomato soup, slowly, holding the spoon with the concentration of a small engineer. And when Alessandro lifted him into the bed, he only tucked the gray bear against his chest and murmured, "The bear likes it here." "Good," Alessandro said. His voice caught on the word. He cleared it. "Good." He turned off the lamp. He did not turn off the small nightlight Bernie had, without asking, placed on the dresser. Downstairs, in the study, Marco was already pouring 2 whiskeys. He handed one across the desk without a word and waited. "Her name is not in any system," Alessandro said. "The station will not help us. The police will not help us either, not without opening a file. I do not want opened. I want her found. Quietly. Every resource, every driver, every diner, every shelter. No cameras but ours. No badges. Understood? No one hears about this outside our inner circle. Not the accountants, not the couriers, not the lieutenants in Queens. Only the men who have already died for us once." Marco nodded slowly. He did not ask why. He touched the silver cross at his throat the way he always did when he was being trusted with something he understood would cost him. "And the boy?" he asked. Alessandro looked into his glass. He did not drink from it. "The boy stays." Marco held his eyes for a long moment. Then he inclined his head, a gesture so small it would have meant nothing to anyone else, and everything to the 2 of them, and left the room. Upstairs, an hour later, Alessandro stood in the corridor outside the guest room. His hand rested on the brass knob. He did not turn it. Inside, Noah was sleeping. Alessandro could hear the faint, even sound of a small breath through the wood, and the faint, even sound was the loudest thing in the house. He stood there for a full hour. He did not open the door, because a man who had lied to senators and priests, a man who had knelt beside coffins without weeping, did not yet know what he would do if, once inside, the boy woke and asked again about his mother, and this time, in the dark, in a bed that was not his own, the silence would not be enough. 3 days passed. Noah did not cry. He did not ask for his mother. He simply woke each morning at 6, dressed himself in the small clothes Bernie had, without explanation, folded outside the bedroom door, and carried the gray bear down the wide staircase to the front hall. Each morning he asked the same question, in the same careful voice. "May I please go wait by the gate?" By the third morning, no one asked any more. The estate's iron gate stood at the end of a long driveway lined with bare oaks 12 feet high, blackened, hinged into 2 stone pillars raised the year Vittorio Moretti bought the property. It had never in 20 years had a child stand in front of it. Noah sat on the low stone bench just inside the gate, the bear on his lap, both small hands wrapped around its middle. He did not fidget. He did not hum. He watched the road beyond the bars the way a much older person might watch the horizon for a ship. At 9 each morning, Bernie brought him warm milk with honey and set the mug beside him without speaking. Noah always thanked him. Bernie always inclined his head. But the old butler's eyes, when he turned back up the drive, were not the eyes of a man performing a kindness. They were eyes that were measuring something. What they were measuring, Alessandro could not yet tell. From the second-floor library, Alessandro watched. Files sat open on his desk. A ledger, a folder Marco had left about a diner near New Rochelle. He read none of them. On the third afternoon, a little past noon, he left the library, walked down the stairs, past Bernie's quiet nod, out through the front door, and down the long gravel drive. He wore no coat. He sat down on the stone bench beside the boy. Noah did not turn. He kept his eyes on the road. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, without looking away, Noah asked in a voice so small it barely disturbed the winter air, "Do you believe my mommy is coming back?" Alessandro did not answer at once. He was a man who had built a life on never saying anything he could not defend later. He had learned, at 22, that words released into the world had a habit of returning as bullets, as subpoenas, as bodies. He turned the question over in his mouth. He thought of the smudged ink on the note now locked inside the top drawer of his study desk. "Please take care of him. I will come back. I promise. I believe," he said slowly, "that any grown-up who loves a child will find a way to come back." The words left him before he had inspected them, and in the moment after they left, Alessandro sat very still beside the boy, and he realized, with the clean, cold shock of a man discovering something in himself he had thought long dead, that he did not know whether he still believed what he had just said. He had not believed it about his father, who had died at a red light on Roosevelt Avenue. He had not believed it about his mother, who had chosen, quietly, to follow. He had not believed it about anyone, for 16 years, and yet he had just said it, out loud, to a child who was listening. Noah nodded once, gravely, as if the answer had settled something. He did not ask a follow-up. He went back to watching the road. That night, Alessandro walked into the guest room without pausing at the door. He crossed the carpet in the dark, straightened the blanket that had slipped, and drew it up to the small chin. Noah did not wake. The bear rose and fell with each slow breath. He stood there a moment longer than he meant to. Then he returned to the library. Above the fireplace hung the oil portrait of Vittorio Moretti, dark suit, gray at the temples, eyes that had never quite learned how to soften. Alessandro poured a whiskey and sat down opposite the painted eyes. "Papa," he said quietly, to the empty room, "did you send him?" There was, of course, no answer. But somewhere at the far end of the estate, past a corridor and a closed door, a small boy slept beneath a blanket that had been drawn up by a hand that had not drawn up a blanket in 20 years, and outside the iron gate, a road stretched away into the dark, waiting for whoever might, one day, come down it. For 3 days, Marco Bellini did not sleep more than 4 hours at a stretch. He watched 48 hours of Grand Central footage frame by frame. He rode the New Haven line up into Connecticut, then east into small commuter towns. He walked into weekly rate motels and cheap diners and asked, in the polite, unhurried voice of a man who was not asking, whether anyone remembered a young woman in a brown coat traveling with a small blonde boy. He left cards. He left cash. The woman had walked out of the western entrance of Grand Central and, 3 days later, she had walked out of every system Marco knew how to read. By late afternoon on the fourth day, Marco was in the study reviewing a Boston map with two of his men. He had just laid a red pin over South Station when the radio at his hip crackled. Bellini. It was Ramon. The gate. His voice was low. Careful. There is a woman at the gate. Young. Alone. Brown coat. No vehicle. She walked here from the local station. That is 2 miles in the snow. She is asking for the master of the house. She says she is the mother of a boy named Noah. A pause. She has knelt. On the snow. I told her to stand up. She will not stand up. Marco was already crossing the study. By the time he reached the front hall, Alessandro had already come out of the library and was walking, without a coat, toward the tall window on the second-floor landing that overlooked the drive. He did not run. Alessandro Moretti had not run since he was 22 years old, but he walked with the deliberate speed of a man who had felt, without being told, that whatever was waiting at the other end of the gravel path had come for him, personally, and had been walking toward him for a long time. He reached the landing window. He looked down. She was kneeling in the snow just outside the iron gate. Thin shoulders, hair pulled back at the nape of her neck, both gloved hands pressed flat against her thighs, palms up, the way a person kneels when they have decided in advance not to get up. The woman lifted her face toward the house. The late afternoon sun, low and gold through the bare oaks, fell across her features cleanly. Alessandro's hand closed on the window frame. He knew her, not from the grainy still Marco had pulled from a Grand Central camera 3 days ago, not from a file. He knew her the way a man knows a face he saw once, at close range, in a room whose door he had closed behind him and told himself he would never open again. 4 years ago, Hell's Kitchen, a backstreet bar, the night of the first anniversary of his father's death. He turned his head. Marco was already behind him, waiting. "Open the gate," Alessandro said. His voice was level. His face gave nothing away. Only Marco, who had stood beside him for 15 years, could have known that the 2 syllables had cost him. Marco spoke into the radio. Down at the end of the drive, Ramon stepped aside. The iron gate began, with a low mechanical hum, to roll open. Alessandro turned from the window. He had taken 2 steps toward the staircase when a small figure burst out of the playroom at the far end of the second-floor corridor. Noah had heard voices. Noah had gone to the window. Noah had seen a woman kneeling on the snow. The boy ran to the balustrade of the upstairs, landing on his uneven small legs, one hand outstretched, the gray bear forgotten on the playroom floor behind him. He reached the railing. He stopped. He stared down through the wrought iron rails at the figure just now rising, slowly, unsteadily, from the snow beyond the opening gate. And then, for the first time since the wooden bench at Grand Central, Noah made a sound. Not a whimper, not a question. A cry sharp, whole, breaking out of him with the raw force of every hour he had held it in for 4 days and had never once let it show. "Mommy!" The cry from the upstairs landing hung in the air a moment longer than it should have. Then the great front door opened, and Ramon stepped inside first, and the woman came in behind him with slow, uneven steps, snow still clinging to the hem of her coat and to her hair where it had fallen loose from its low knot. She did not look around at the marble floor or the tall windows. She looked at nothing. Her eyes were fixed on the sound she had just heard from the second floor, and her whole body was leaning toward it the way a compass leans north. Marco met her at the threshold, gently. "This way, please, ma'am." He guided her, not touching, only walking beside into the sitting room off the main corridor. Bernie had already lit the fire. The old butler stood by the mantel with a folded wool throw over his arm. He offered it without a word. She took it because she was shaking too hard to refuse. She did not sit. She stood by the fire with the throw around her shoulders and looked at the door. Alessandro came down the stairs slowly. He had let himself take the stairs slowly on purpose. He had needed the seconds. At the bottom, he paused, straightened his cuffs, the way a man straightens his cuffs before a hearing, and stepped into the sitting room. She was 27. He had not known that 4 years ago. He had not asked. Her coat, up close, was thinner than it had looked from the second-floor window, the lining worn through at the elbows, the buttons no longer matching. There were shadows under her eyes that had nothing to do with the winter afternoon. She lifted her face. For the second time in her life, Emily looked directly at Alessandro Moretti. For the second time in his life, Alessandro looked directly at the woman named Emily. Neither of them said anything. He remembered the shape of her hands. He remembered the particular gentleness with which she had set a glass of water down after his 4th whiskey. He remembered her not asking his last name. She remembered the weight of his head against her shoulder in a small upstairs room at 4 in the morning. She remembered the way a grown man could cry without making a sound. She remembered the folded bills on the nightstand when she woke, and the cold light through a curtain, and the door already closed. Neither of them, in that first frozen second, could quite make the man in the tailored black suit fit together with the ruin of a stranger who had once wept into her sleeve, or the pale, thin woman in the ill-lined coat fit together with the waitress whose kindness had been the only thing standing between him and the pistol in his desk drawer 4 years ago. And then the door behind Alessandro burst open. Noah had gotten past the guard in the corridor. Noah had come down the whole long staircase on his uneven small legs by himself, because a boy who has been waiting 4 days does not wait a 5th minute. He came through the doorway at a run. 2 steps into the room, he stopped. He stared at her. For half a heartbeat, he looked at his mother as if he were not sure the woman by the fireplace in the light of a strange house was the same woman he had last seen on a wooden bench at Grand Central. The half-heartbeat was the longest silence of his short life. Then his face broke, and he ran. Emily dropped to her knees on the rug before he reached her. She caught him against her chest. She wrapped both arms around him so tightly her shoulders shook. She pressed her face into the crown of his blonde hair, and she cried, not loudly, not with any sound at all, only with the whole soundless heaving of a body that had been holding something for years and could finally, for one moment, let it go. Noah did not cry. He held on. Alessandro stood 2 paces from them and could not move. He was not, in that moment, an heir. He was not an empire. He was not a boss. He was a man in a doorway watching a woman he had not asked the name of, holding a child he had not known he had. At his shoulder, in the doorway, Marco Bellini took in the scene. Marco looked at the woman, at the boy, at the way the child fit into her arms, as though he had been shaped for that particular hollow. He looked at Alessandro's face, which he had known for 15 years, and which he had never once seen wear the expression it was wearing now. Marco understood. In the 3 seconds it took him to look, everything he needed to understand. He said nothing. He stepped back into the corridor and, very quietly, drew the sitting room door closed behind him. An hour later, Bernie carried Noah, half asleep, and still holding the hem of his mother's sleeve, up to the guest room. Emily kissed his forehead at the doorway. The old butler promised, in a voice made specifically for that promise, that he would stay in the chair beside the bed until she came back up. She let go of the sleeve. Noah did not cry. He watched her walk down the corridor until she turned the corner. Then Emily followed Alessandro into the study. Marco was already there, standing by the far window. He nodded to her once, respectfully, and did not sit. There was a low chair on the near side of the desk. Alessandro gestured to it. Emily sat down as carefully as a woman who had not been allowed to sit down in a long time. He did not ask her a question. He simply waited. She looked at her hands for a moment. She swallowed. Then she began. She had left Manhattan the morning after that night. Not because he had left the money, she had understood the money, even then, for what it was, but because she had understood, sitting alone in that upstairs room with the sun coming through the curtain, that whatever kind of life the stranger in the black suit lived, it was not a life she could quietly become part of. She had moved across the river to Queens. She had taken a different job. She had told herself the night had been a kindness, and then she had told herself, more firmly, to stop turning it over in her mind. 2 months later, she had learned she was pregnant. She had not looked for him. She had known only a first name Alex, and even that, she had suspected at the time, was not the whole of it. She had not thought she had the right. She had told herself that a man who left money on a nightstand did not want to be found by news like this, and she had told herself, more importantly, that a child of hers deserved to be raised without the shadow of a father who had had to be hunted down. She had had Noah alone. She had worked 2 shifts for 3 years, days at a diner in Astoria, nights, when she could get them, at a bakery that let her bring the baby in a sling. A neighbor in the building watched him when both shifts ran together. She had not, in 3 years, missed a rent payment until last month. Last month, the diner had closed. The bakery had cut nights. The landlord had begun leaving notices. Noah had come down with bronchitis in early October and had not fully shaken it. The prescriptions had come to more than the week's groceries. She had begun, on very bad nights, to do arithmetic that no mother should ever be doing. She had believed she said this with her eyes on the corner of the rug, not on Alessandro, that in a wealthy, busy station, where good families passed through by the thousand, a decent family would find a small blonde boy in a canvas backpack and give him what she could no longer give. She had written the note. She had set him on the bench. She had kissed his forehead. She had walked away. Her voice steadied here. And then, on the next sentence, it broke. 3 blocks from the station, she said. Her legs had simply stopped working. She had sunk down onto a curb and had understood, all at once, in a wave that had knocked the air out of her, that there was no future good enough to justify what a child would remember, no family kind enough, no warmth strong enough, no amount of anything would ever be worth what she had just done. She had run back. She had run the 3 blocks in a coat that was too thin for running. She had come through the western entrance, sobbing for breath. She had gone straight to the bench. The bench had been empty. Her voice stopped. She did not finish the sentence. Alessandro did not ask her another question. He rose. He went to the sideboard. He poured a mug of warm water from the kettle Bernie had left there, and he set it in front of her without a word. Then he sat down opposite her again, and he let the silence hold. It held for a long time. Then he opened the top drawer of the desk. He took out a small folded piece of paper, ink smudged at one corner where a small palm had once rested on it, and he laid it flat on the desk between them. Emily looked at it. For 3 years, she had believed she would never see that paper again. She reached toward it. Her fingers stopped an inch above it. Her whole hand was shaking too badly to close the distance. Alessandro spoke quietly. His voice was the voice of a man who had held many pieces of paper in his life contracts, deeds, court orders, confessions, and had never held one that had weighed what this one weighed. "Take it," he said. "It belongs to you." Emily closed her hand around the note with both hands, as though it were something that might otherwise fly away, and for the first time in 4 years, she allowed herself to cry in front of a man. Dr. Elena Ricci arrived at the estate before 10 the next morning. She had been the Moretti family's private physician for 11 years. She was 45, quiet, precise, and asked no more questions than she was paid to ask. She carried a small leather case up the front steps, was shown into the second-floor guest room, and knelt beside a small blonde boy who was still holding a gray teddy bear. She did not draw blood from Noah. She only asked, very gently, if she could borrow the small hairbrush from the canvas backpack on the floor, the one with the name written in blue crayon across the flap. Noah nodded. She lifted 3 hairs from the bristles into a labeled envelope. She thanked him. She told him he had been very brave. Noah, who did not know what he had been brave for, said, "Okay." Then she went downstairs to the study, drew Alessandro's blood herself, sealed both samples, and told him to expect a call in 48 hours. 48 hours is a long time in a house that has forgotten how to wait. Emily stayed. There was no discussion of her leaving. Bernie had, without being asked, made up the smaller bedroom at the end of the second-floor corridor for her. That night, after Noah had fallen asleep with one hand still curled around the hem of her sleeve, she came down to the library because she could not sleep, and she found Alessandro already there. He did not send her away. They sat on opposite sides of the low fire. She held her mug of tea in both hands. He did not drink the whiskey he had poured. She began to talk, slowly, the way a person begins to speak of things they have never before said out loud to anyone. She told him about the fever nights, the ones when Noah's temperature had climbed past 103, and she had held him in the bathtub under lukewarm water while he cried, and she counted his breaths. She told him about the winter Noah had learned to walk on the linoleum of a Queen studio apartment, and how she had cried on the phone to her mother because she had been alone for it. She told him about the small victories that no one had ever witnessed. The first word, the first full sentence, the first time he had said her name and meant it. He listened without interrupting. When she was done, he was quiet for a long time. Then he told her about the intersection at Roosevelt Avenue, about the sound of the windshield, about running 2 blocks with a gun already drawn and no one left to shoot, about kneeling on wet asphalt beside a man whose eyes were still open, about his mother, 1 year later, choosing quietly to follow. He had not told the whole of that night to anyone, not even to Marco, in 16 years. 2 wounds, one carried through 3 years of solitary motherhood, one carried through 16 years of solitary command, touched in the light of a low fire for the first time. Neither of them apologized. Neither of them needed to. Dawn came in gray through the tall library windows. The call from Dr. Ricci came at 10:30 the second morning. Alessandro took it in the study, standing, with the door closed and Emily seated in the low chair opposite the desk. He listened without speaking. He set the phone down. He did not turn to her immediately. He looked instead at the top drawer of the desk, the drawer that had held the folded note for 3 days. Then he said, without lifting his eyes, 99.99998%. Emily did not move. He said it again, more quietly, as though the number were something he needed to hear himself pronounce twice before he could believe it. "He is my son." The chair he was standing beside caught him as his knees went. He sat down heavily. He covered his face with both hands. The man who had, for 16 years, made grown men lower their voices when he walked into a room. The man who had stood at gravesides without weeping, who had signed death warrants without blinking, who had built an empire on the discipline of never letting anyone see him break, wept quietly into his own palms in the study of his own house, with a woman he had barely known 4 years ago sitting 3 feet away. Watching him grieve for 3 years, he had not been given the chance to grieve. Some losses cannot be taken back, but they can be loved back. Emily slid off the chair onto the rug and knelt in front of the desk. She began to say, in a broken voice, that she was sorry. She was sorry for the years. She was sorry for the bench. She was sorry for the note. She was sorry for every single stop. Alessandro's voice was hoarse, but steady. He reached forward and, very gently, took her by the wrists and drew her up until she was sitting on her knees, rather than kneeling. Not to me. Do not kneel to me. He did not let go of her wrists. He said, quietly, the only sentence that mattered. From today, this is your home, both of you. A week passed. The largest bedroom on the 2nd floor, the one with the corner windows overlooking the garden, was made up for Emily and Noah. Bernie moved a small folding cot in beside the wide bed the first night, but by the 2nd morning it had been quietly removed. Noah slept with his mother now. He had waited long enough. Alessandro came home before 6 every evening. In 20 years, no one in the Moretti organization had ever seen him leave the city before 8. Lieutenants who called the office at 7 found the office empty. Cars pulled up to the estate in daylight instead of after dark. Marco covered the schedule without comment. He rescheduled 2 meetings and canceled a 3rd. He did not ask why. He did not need to. In the evenings, Alessandro sat on the rug of the study with his back against the leg of the desk and a chessboard between him and his son. He was not teaching Noah chess. He was teaching him to sort the pieces by color, which was, at 3 years old, ambitious enough. Noah lined the white pieces up in a careful row along the edge of the board. He set the black pieces in a matching row facing them. Then, with the seriousness of a small general, he moved 1 white pawn 1 square forward, looked up at Alessandro, and said, "Your turn." Alessandro moved 1 black pawn 1 square forward. Noah nodded gravely and moved another. They played this game which was not chess, and which had no ending, and which suited both of them exactly for an hour every evening. Emily began to cook. She had not asked permission. She had simply gone down to the kitchen on the 3rd morning and stood in the doorway until Bernie, without a word, stepped aside and gestured her in. She had made pasta with a tomato sauce that had come out of nothing but canned tomatoes, garlic, a little butter, and thyme. The whole house had smelled of it by evening. It had been a smell the estate had not carried in 20 years. Alessandro had come through the front door that night, stopped in the hall, and stood for a moment with his eyes closed. Marco stood outside on the back terrace with a cigarette he was not really smoking. Alessandro came out to stand beside him. Neither of them spoke for a while. Then Marco said, quietly, still looking at the garden, "In 15 years, I have never seen you smile like that." Alessandro did not answer at once. He looked down at the gravel at his feet. He did not deny it. Marco flicked ash into the tray on the low wall, and did not push. He was not a man who pushed. He touched the silver cross at his throat with 2 fingers, the way he always did when he was standing near something he considered sacred. Then he put out the cigarette and went back inside. Inside, in the kitchen, Emily was showing Noah how to grate cheese into a small blue bowl. Bernie was setting the long dining table for 3, folding cloth napkins into perfect triangles, the way he had folded them for Vittorio Moretti and for Alessandro's mother 20 years ago. Noah dropped a small handful of grated cheese onto the floor. He looked up, quickly, at Bernie, expecting reprimand. Bernie only inclined his head with the practiced grace of a butler who had, over 4 decades, seen every kind of small disaster a kitchen could produce. "Not to worry, Master Noah," he said mildly. "The floor forgives cheese." Noah laughed. It was the first laugh the estate had heard from him. For a fraction of a second, so brief that Emily, who was smiling, did not catch it, and Alessandro, who was still on the terrace, did not see it. Bernie's eyes followed the boy as he darted past into the corridor, and in that fraction of a second, the old butler's expression was not the expression of a man watching a child. It was the expression of a man watching an animal cross a field toward a snare. Then Bernie turned back to the napkins, and the moment was gone, and no one had seen it. That night, at 11:47, the private phone on Alessandro's nightstand rang. He picked it up on the 2nd ring. Emily was asleep in the room across the corridor. Noah was asleep with her, the gray bear tucked between them. "Hello." There was no voice on the other end, only breathing. Slow, even, deliberate, the breathing of a person who did not want to be recognized by voice, but who wanted, very specifically, to be heard breathing. Alessandro did not speak again. He held the phone to his ear for 12 seconds. He counted the breaths. 6. Then the line clicked off. He set the phone down carefully on the nightstand. He sat for a long time on the edge of the bed in the dark. He did not go across the corridor. He did not wake Emily. He simply sat, in the dark, in a house that for 1 week had smelled of tomato sauce and had contained the laughter of a small boy, and he understood, with the cold, patient certainty of a man who had been a target for 20 years, that a week of happiness in this house had been noticed by someone, and that someone had just made sure he knew it. Saturday, a thin layer of snow lay across the estate garden, the kind that had come down in the small hours and had not yet begun to melt. The oaks along the drive stood black against a white lawn. It was the first pretty Saturday of the winter. Emily came down at 10 with Noah's coat folded over her arm and asked, in the polite half-question of a woman still learning she was allowed to ask, whether it might be all right if she went into the village to buy him a proper pair of winter gloves. His old ones had a hole at the thumb. She had noticed it that morning. Alessandro was already in the study with 2 accountants and a leather folder open on the desk. He looked up. He nodded once. He asked Tommy to bring the car around. Tommy was 30, quiet, one of the men Marco had personally vetted 3 years earlier. He drove Emily to the village. Noah stayed at the estate with the tutor Alessandro had hired that week, a soft-spoken woman named Mrs. Halpern, who came in on weekend mornings for 2 hours to read with him in the playroom. Marco was not in the car with them. No one in the estate had seen Marco all morning. His usual seat at the breakfast table had been empty. His bedroom door had been locked from the inside at 9. By noon, when one of the guards had gone up to knock for a scheduled brief, the door had been open and the room empty. On the small writing desk lay a single folded note in Marco's block handwriting. Private matter. Back by nightfall. The guard read it. He set it back down. He did not report it to Alessandro. Marco Bellini had not been required to explain his schedule to anyone but the boss in 15 years, and no one in this house had ever been the man who broke that. Alessandro was in the financial meeting on the ground floor and did not notice that Marco was gone. At 3 in the afternoon, Mrs. Halpern came down the second-floor corridor with a soft, frightened voice. Noah was not in the playroom. She had stepped out to refill her tea for 4 minutes. When she had come back, the room had been empty. She had checked the bathroom. She had checked his bedroom. She had checked her own coat pocket, which was foolish. She was very sorry. She had come to find someone. By 4 o'clock, every corridor of the estate had been walked twice. The gray teddy bear was on Noah's bed. It had been placed there, not dropped. Its arms were laid out neatly across the pillow, the way Emily had left it after making the bed that morning. A child who was leaving on his own would not have left the bear. The side kitchen door onto the back garden was standing open. There was a single smear of dried mud on the flagstones just inside it. No footprints leading away. The snow beyond was disturbed, but disturbed in the way something dragged through it disturbs snow, and by 4 o'clock the sun had already softened the disturbed edges into ambiguity. There was no sign of a struggle, no overturned chairs, no cry heard by anyone. The second-floor security cameras had been disabled from 2 o'clock to 3:15. 75 minutes exactly. Alessandro stood in the center of Noah's bedroom. His hands were closed at his sides. He had been closing them for so long, and so tightly, that his own fingernails had cut through the skin of his palms. A thin line of blood was running down the outside of his right hand and dripping onto the cream carpet. He was not aware of it. Emily came home at 4:12. She saw the front door standing open before Tommy could get around the car. She saw the guards on the drive with radios in their hands. She dropped the small paper bag with the new gloves and she ran. And halfway down the corridor toward the staircase, her legs gave out under her, and she went down onto her hands and knees on the polished floor. She did not cry out. She only made a sound, one sound that no one who heard it would forget. The guards began calling Marco. The first call rang and went to voicemail. The second call rang and went to voicemail. The third, fifth, 10th call rang and went to voicemail. By 6 o'clock, Alessandro had locked down every road off the north shore of Long Island, every bridge, every ferry, every gate. It was already, he knew, too late for lockdown to matter, but there was nothing else his hands could do that was not shaking. At 6:47, his private phone chimed once, a text message, no number, one image attached. Noah, seated on the floor of a room with concrete walls, small wrists bound in front of him with plastic ties, gray eyes wide, wet, not crying, only staring at the camera with the terrible, quiet patience of a child who was already, at 3 years old, trying not to make it worse. Alessandro did not make a sound. He set the phone face down on the desk with careful, deliberate hands. Then he lifted it again, forwarded the image to Marco's line without a message, and put it back down. Marco did not answer. At 11:40 at night, the sound of a heavy engine reached the front gate. Marco's black SUV rolled up the drive. It parked crooked in the gravel. He got out. His overcoat was streaked with dried mud from the knees down. There was mud in his hair. His eyes were sunken with a kind of exhaustion that was older than the day. He crossed the front steps 2 at a time and came in through the door, still fastening the top button of his coat, and he stopped in the front hall when he saw the number of men standing in it in silence. He looked from face to face. "What happened?" he asked. No one answered him. 24 hours. By the following night, the technical team, Alessandro kept on retainer in the city, had rebuilt every frame of security footage that the estate's compromised system had failed to erase. They had worked in a locked room in the basement without leaving it, on 3 laptops connected to nothing. 2 of them were former bureau. 1 was former army. All 3 of them owed Alessandro Moretti a debt older than the boy they were trying to find. At 9:10 the next evening, they came upstairs to the study. The lead technician set a laptop down on the desk in front of Alessandro and turned it around. Emily was on the couch behind him, wrapped in the same wool throw Bernie had draped over her shoulders the afternoon she had first entered the house. She had not slept. Her eyes were red and dry. The technician spoke quietly, the way one speaks when the news is a knife. The 3rd-floor corridor camera was outside the blackout zone. It caught someone at 1:47 yesterday afternoon walking toward the 2nd-floor stairwell from the servants' passage. He pressed a key. The screen showed a figure in a long black overcoat, hood pulled up, moving with the unhurried economy of a man who knew exactly where the blind spots were. The face was not visible, but the shoulders were. The gait was the way the right hand hung slightly further from the body than the left. An old habit from years of carrying a holster on that side was biometric match against everyone in our staff database. The gait, the shoulder-to-hip ratio, the walking cadence. He paused. 94% match to Marco Bellini. He pressed another key. The forensic pull was less ambiguous. A single, latent fingerprint had been lifted from the outer sill of Noah's bedroom window, the window whose latch had been undone from the inside, through which a small body could have been passed to someone waiting below on the trellis. The print belonged to Marco Bellini. It had been placed there recently. It was fresh. The technician set a small evidence bag on the desk last. Inside it was a prepaid burner phone, still in its cheap plastic casing. It had been found 40 minutes ago inside the glove compartment of the black SUV Marco had driven out of the estate on Saturday morning. There were 3 text messages on it, all to the same number, no contact name. The last message had gone out at 1:52 yesterday afternoon, done at 2. Alessandro looked at the screen. He looked at the fingerprint report. He looked at the phone. He did not speak. Behind him, Bernie stepped forward from the sideboard and refilled the coffee cup at Alessandro's elbow. His hand did not shake. His face did not change. He had refilled that cup 10,000 times in 20 years, and this refill looked no different from any of the others. "Bring him up," Alessandro said quietly. They brought Marco up. He came into the study without a coat. His shirt was clean but rumpled, the collar open he had not been permitted to change since the night before. He looked at the laptop on the desk. He looked at the evidence bag. He looked at the printout beside it. He did not sit. "You want me to explain? I want you to explain." Marco was silent for a moment. Then he said evenly, "I was in Brooklyn from noon until just before 5. It was personal. I do not want to say why. There is no one who can put me anywhere at any specific time during those hours. The phone. I have never seen it before. It was in your car. I know it was in my car. I do not know how it got there." The room was very quiet. Marco looked, for the first time, directly at Alessandro. He did not look angry. He did not look afraid. He looked, more than anything else, tired like a man who had understood, in the space of a single breath, exactly what was being done to him. He lowered his head. "Alessandro, have you trusted me for the last 15 years? Alessandro did not answer at once. When he did, it was quiet, and it was the truth. "I used to." Behind him, unmoving, Bernie set the coffee pot back on the sideboard. Emily rose from the couch. She crossed to Alessandro and closed her hand around his wrist hard, the way a woman holds onto a rope in a current. "Alessandro." Her voice was thin. Marco would not do this. Would he? Alessandro did not answer her either. He looked at the man who had stood beside him for 15 years. He looked at the woman whose hand was on his wrist. He looked at the image of a bound 3-year-old boy that had come through his phone at 6:47 the day before. "Put him in his own room," he said. His voice was level. "Post 2 men outside. He is not to leave the estate until I decide what to do." Marco did not resist. They walked him out of the study. The lock on his bedroom door, a lock installed for his own privacy 15 years ago, and never once used, turned from the outside for the first time in its life. Inside, Marco sat down on the edge of his own bed. He looked at the ceiling. He looked at his own hands, which he knew had touched none of the things they were being accused of touching. He looked at the door, and he listened to the 2 men breathing on the other side of it. He understood one thing, very clearly, and it settled into him with the calm cold of a decision already made. If he stayed in this room, the truth would die in it with him. At 6 the next morning, Alessandro sent 2 men upstairs to bring Marco to the study. The corridor outside Marco's bedroom was still guarded. The 2 men on watch had not moved from their post since 11 the night before. Their eyes were red. They had heard nothing through the door in 7 hours, no footsteps, no water running, no chair scraped across the floor. They had assumed, in the way tired men assume, that the man inside had finally gone to sleep. The lead guard turned the key. He pushed the door open. The bedside lamp was still on. The bed had been turned down but had not been slept in. The window on the far wall was wide open. Cold air poured through it across the polished floor. The window opened onto the low secondary roof over the west portico, the kind of drop that no ordinary intruder would find. Marco Bellini, however, had personally designed the estate's current security architecture 7 years ago. He had walked the roofline himself. He had marked the blind spots himself. He had written the perimeter protocols himself. He knew where every camera was. He knew where none of them were. The personal safe built into the wall behind the closet door stood open. The passport was gone. The stack of emergency cash held for exactly the kind of night no one ever expected was gone. The backup Beretta, kept for reasons Marco had never once had to explain to anyone, was gone. Down at the service gate, the log showed a single vehicle exit at 4:12 in the morning. Marco's black SUV, driven by Marco, alone. He had not spoken to the gate guard. He had not slowed at the checkpoint. He had lifted one hand in acknowledgement and driven straight through, and the gate guard, out of 15 years of habit, had lifted the barrier without asking. Alessandro stood in the empty bedroom. He did not raise his voice. He did not curse. He simply stood there and looked at the open window, and the cold air, and the empty safe. By 7 in the morning, every senior man in the Moretti organization understood what had happened. Whatever fragment of doubt might have survived the previous evening, whatever small, stubborn corner of loyalty had wanted to believe there had been another explanation, did not survive the sight of that empty bed. Innocent men did not go out of second-floor windows at 4 in the morning. Innocent men did not take their passports. Innocent men, above all, did not run from Alessandro Moretti. In the study, Bernie poured a fresh coffee. His hand was as steady as it had been every morning of the last 20 years. He confessed himself. "Sir," the old butler said quietly. "No one runs if his heart is clean." Alessandro did not respond. At 11:47 that morning, the private phone on the desk rang. "No number." Alessandro answered on the second ring and said nothing. Marco's voice was hoarse. Wind was moving in the background, the particular hollow wind of an open coastal road. "Alessandro, listen to me before you speak. I did not take Noah. I swear it on my father's soul. I have never once in my life put a hand on that boy." "Then who did?" There was a silence so honest it was worse than any lie. "I don't know." Alessandro closed his eyes. "I don't know who," Marco went on, quickly. "But I know it is someone who has been inside our house long enough to put my fingerprint on a window I have never touched. Someone who knew the camera rotation. Someone who knew I would be out on Saturday. It is not a Bianchi man. It is not a stranger. It is one of us. That is the only thing I am sure of. You are asking me to trust you. I am asking you to hear me. You went out a second-floor window at 4 in the morning, Marco, because if I had stayed in that room, whoever did this would have had 48 hours to move Noah, to erase every thread, and to kill him before you ever found a single answer. The only way I can still help you is from the outside, free, looking. The moment you locked that door on me, I stopped being useful to your son. Do you understand?" Alessandro said nothing. "Give me 72 hours, Marco said. "That is all I am asking. 72 hours to find the person whose hands actually did this. If I am wrong, if at the end of those hours I have brought you nothing, I will walk back through the front gate on my own 2 feet, and you can do whatever you decide is right." Alessandro opened his eyes. He looked, for a long moment, at the top drawer of the desk, the drawer that had once held a smudged, folded note. Then he spoke, and his voice was level, and it was the voice of a man who no longer had the luxury of hoping. If I find you first, Marco, before you find your truth, I will put the bullet in you myself, with my own hand. The line was quiet. I know, Marco said. Alessandro ended the call. He set the phone down carefully on the desk. Then he opened the door of the study and gave a single order to the man standing outside. Every man we have, every road, every port, every private airstrip on the eastern seaboard. I want Marco Bellini found. Alive if possible, dead if not. The order went out within the hour. By noon, every asset the Moretti family had between Boston and Virginia Beach was moving. Marco drove east. The road out of the estate ran through low winter forest and then along the northern shore of Long Island, past shuttered summer houses and marinas whose piers had been pulled up for the season. He kept the SUV under the speed limit. He drove with both hands on the wheel and his eyes on the mirror. He had no name in his head. He had only 72 hours and a single instinct that the person who had put his fingerprint on a window he had never touched had been walking the corridors of the Moretti estate for a very long time. By late afternoon, he pulled off the county road at a shuttered gas station near Riverhead. The pumps had not been serviced in months. Behind the boarded-up mini-mart, a small dirt lot backed onto pine woods, he parked with the SUV nose out, killed the engine, and opened the backup laptop he kept sealed in a waterproof case under the rear bench. He did not connect to a network he could be traced through. He worked off a dated offline copy of the Moretti household personnel file he had duplicated 4 years ago and never once opened a habit, not a suspicion. He began at the bottom of the list, with the newest hires. He worked upward: kitchen staff, cleared; groundskeepers, cleared; drivers, cleared. He was 2/3 of the way up the list when a pair of headlights swept across the pine trees at the far end of the lot. He closed the laptop without saving. They had found him faster than he had expected. That meant they had triangulated off his phone, the phone he had, deliberately, not yet powered down, because he had needed 1 more hour of connection to keep working. He had spent the hour. It had cost him. 2 black vehicles turned into the lot from the county road, then a third. Then, further back, the low silver profile of a Bentley. Marco pulled the Beretta from his waistband. He did not raise it. The men who stepped out of the black vehicles were men he had trained. Half of them had served under him for a decade. He recognized every face in the headlights. 2 of them, out of habit, kept their weapons pointed at the ground rather than at him. 2 others did not. The line of loyalty in the Moretti family had cracked cleanly down the middle, exactly the way a chair cracks along its weakest grain. Marco. It was Sal, the senior lieutenant. His voice was flat, but his eyes were miserable. Put it down and walk out. The boss says he wants you alive. Sal. Marco kept his hand at his side. Whoever did this is still inside that house. If I go back with you, they walk free tonight. Do you understand what I am telling you? Put it down, Marco. Sal, listen to me. Someone at the far end of the line, a younger man, one of the ones Marco had not personally vetted, decided the conversation had gone on long enough. He fired. The first shot went wide, into the sheet metal of the SUV. The second did not. It hit Marco low, in the abdomen, just below the ribs on the right side. He felt the punch of it before he heard it, and he heard it before he understood what had happened. And by the time all 3 things caught up to each other, he was already moving not toward the men, but away, along the tree line, toward the cliff road that ran behind the property down to the water. Return fire cracked from behind him. Someone in his old crew was covering his retreat. Someone else was cursing them for it. The neat black lines of the Moretti organization had come apart in the pines behind an abandoned gas station, and half of the men who had followed Marco into a dozen firefights were shooting at the other half in the dark. Rain began to fall. He ran along the cliff road with one hand pressed against his stomach and the other still holding the Beretta. The blood was warm against his palm and then cold against the wind. The road curved north. The drop to his left widened. He could hear the black water 30 meters below, moving against the rocks. Headlights swept the curve behind him. The Bentley pulled up hard. Doors opened. Alessandro stepped out into the rain without a coat, without a weapon in his hand, walking toward him the way a man walks toward the end of something. Marco stopped at the edge of the cliff. He turned. For a long second, the 2 of them looked at each other in the beam of the headlights, brothers in every way that had ever mattered except the one that mattered tonight. Marco spoke first. His voice was quiet, and it was steady, and it was the voice of a man who had made a decision. One day, Alessandro, you will know you trusted the wrong man. Then he let himself fall backward. The cliff took him. Alessandro reached the edge 4 seconds too late. He looked down into the black. There was rain, and there were rocks, and there was a churn of water where a body had gone in, and then even that was gone. Back at the estate, in the study Alessandro had left in a hurry 3 hours before, a small object sat on the corner of the desk. It was the silver cross on its worn chain, the one Marco had taken from around his own neck and set down in that room on the night the evidence had been laid out. At 11:40 that night, before Alessandro's car turned back through the estate gates, Bernie stepped quietly into the study. He picked up the cross with 2 fingers. He turned it once in the lamplight, examining the back of it, where 3 small numbers had been engraved along the base of the vertical bar. He read them. He committed them to memory. Then he slid the cross into the top drawer of his own service cabinet, and he closed the drawer, and he went back out into the corridor to wait for the master of the house to come home. Alessandro stood at the edge of the cliff for 2 hours. The rain did not stop. It came in slantwise off the sound, cold as steel, soaking through the wool of his suit and running down the back of his collar. He did not move. Behind him, on the road, the 2 black vehicles that had brought his men parked with their headlights aimed out over the drop, and the searchlights his lieutenants had unloaded from the trunk swept the black water 30 meters below in slow, methodical arcs. For the first 20 minutes, they called Marco's name. By the end of the first hour, no one was calling anything. The searchlights found rocks. They found kelp. They found a piece of driftwood that had washed in with the tide and lay half covered by white foam. They found a running gutter of rainwater pouring off the cliff face into the sea. They did not find a body. Sal came up beside him at the 90-minute mark, hat off, water running from his hair. "Boss." His voice was low, careful. "The water is under 5 degrees. He took a round through the abdomen. "From that height, on those rocks, in that surf I know, there is nothing here for us to find." "I know, Sal." But Alessandro did not step back from the edge. He knew what Sal knew. He knew the arithmetic of cold water in a torn artery. He knew that a man could go under in that surf and be 100 yards out to sea within 4 minutes, and that the tide beyond the point ran east and did not give things back. He knew, in the calm, precise part of him that had run an empire for 16 years, that Marco Bellini was dead. And yet for one moment only, standing at the edge with rain running down the side of his face, a small, unwelcome thought moved through him. He remembered the voice on the phone the day before. I don't know who. Not a name, not a target, not a story, just the plain, unornamented admission of a man who did not have the answer. He had been in this business for 20 years. In 20 years, he had heard many men lie to save themselves. Guilty men had names for him. Guilty men had elaborate accounts, ready-made explanations, half-truths dressed up as full ones. Guilty men, when cornered, had always been able to point somewhere. Marco had said, I don't know. For one moment on that cliff, Alessandro wondered, honestly, whether an innocent man had sounded like that. Then he pushed the thought away. He had to. If he let that thought stand, it would gut him more completely than any bullet the sea had just taken. In his right hand, closed against his palm, was the small silver cross on its worn chain. Bernie had brought it to him just before he had left the estate 3 hours earlier. The old butler had appeared at the study door with the cross laid across his open palm and had said, quietly, Sir, he left this on the desk the night before he ran. I thought perhaps you would want it. Alessandro had taken it without thinking. He had put it into his coat pocket. He had not looked at the back of it. He had not thought about it again until this moment. Now he stood at the edge of the cliff and closed his fist around it. He closed his hand so tightly that the arms of the cross bit into the meat of his palm. He closed it until he could feel the small pain through the numb of the cold. He closed it until, under the running rain, a thin line of his own blood began to slip between his fingers. The greatest traitor in a man's life is not the one he hates, it is the one he has stopped listening to. He did not hear the line in his own head. It was not a thought he was capable of thinking yet. It was only, at that moment, a shape somewhere at the back of his chest, waiting for the day it would be given a name. At last, past 2 a.m, Sal touched his elbow. Boss, come. Alessandro turned and walked back to the Bentley without looking at the sea again. They reached the estate near 4. Emily was standing in the front hall. She had not gone to bed. She was still wearing the same clothes she had been wearing the day Noah had disappeared, which was now 3 days ago, and someone, Bernie, probably had put a shawl around her shoulders that she had not registered receiving. She looked at Alessandro's face. She looked at the closed hand at his side. She looked at the thin line of blood on the marble floor, where he had let his fingers open just once during the walk from the car. She did not ask. He did not answer. He walked past her toward the study, and she did not follow. She understood. with the terrible new instinct grief gives a woman, that whatever news had come home in the car had come home without a body. He was still in the study, sitting behind the desk without having taken off his wet coat, when the private phone on the desk chimed. One video message, no number. He tapped it open. The video was 30 seconds long. It began on Noah on the concrete floor of a room Alessandro did not recognize. Wrists still bound, mouth free now, blindfold gone. Small face streaked and pale in the light of a bare bulb overhead. The boy was alive. The boy was breathing. The boy's eyes were the same steady gray they had always been, and something in Alessandro's chest cracked open just enough to let the air back in. Then the camera panned up. A man stepped into the frame behind Noah and rested one heavy hand on the boy's shoulder, and the man was smiling. Salvatore Bianchi. Salvatore Bianchi did not hurry. He was a man who had spent 30 years learning that pleasure, in this life, was best taken slowly. He was 52, thick-shouldered, silver at the temples, wearing a dark cashmere sweater against the cold of whatever room he was in. The light behind him was industrial, a bare bulb, concrete walls, the corner of what might have been a shipping crate at the edge of the frame. He looked directly into the camera as though he were looking into Alessandro Moretti's face. "Alessandro," he said, warmly, the way a man greets an old dinner guest. "Please forgive the theater. I know it has been a long few days for you." He rested his hand more firmly on Noah's shoulder. The boy did not react. The boy was watching the wall. "Let me save you some time." Bianchi smiled. "The footage in your third-floor corridor, the biometric match against your dear friend Marco, the fingerprint on the window, the little burner phone in his glove compartment, all of it, every last piece. I put those in your house." He waited, as though he were giving Alessandro a moment to appreciate a well-turned line in a play. "I could not have done it, of course, from Brooklyn. That kind of work requires hands inside the walls, hands that know your camera rotations, hands that know which drawer Marco keeps his SUV keys in, hands that have been walking the corridors of your family's home for more than 20 years. He did not say a name. He did not need to. He tilted his head slightly, and his smile widened into something that was very close to affection. "I will not name my man, Alessandro. That would be discourteous. I will simply tell you that he has served both a father and a son in that house, and he has been loyal to me for the last 6 of those years, and you have never once looked at him twice." Alessandro, standing behind the desk in his wet coat, did not move. "Now," Bianchi's tone shifted, still gentle, "to business. The port of Brooklyn, the northern half, the entire container operation, including the 3 shipping lanes into the Sound that your father put in place 40 years ago. Signed over to me, cleanly, through the shell company I will provide to your lawyer. 24 hours from the moment this video reaches you." He glanced down at Noah with something like a father's fondness. "Do it, and the boy comes home. Refuse, or delay, or try to be clever, and I will send him back to you 1 finger at a time, right hand first. I will begin with the smallest. I am a traditional man." The frame held for a beat. 24 hours, Alessandro. Consider it carefully." The video ended on the smile. Alessandro stood at his desk for a long time and did not move. The house was very quiet around him. Somewhere at the far end of the corridor, a clock ticked. The rain had stopped. Water was still dripping from the hem of his coat onto the rug where he stood. He was not aware of it. "A person inside my house for more than 20 years. His mind moved once quickly, expertly through the list. There were only 4 people on the Moretti estate who could claim that tenure. 2 of them had served his mother and were now dead. One of them had retired to a small house in New Jersey 5 years ago. That left 1. He did not let the name form in his mouth. Not yet. Not with the door open. Not with the possibility that the man in question might be, at this moment, listening from the corridor. He reached slowly into the breast pocket of his coat. He drew out the pocket watch. It was small and heavy in his palm, the case worn along the edges by 70 years of a man's thumb, first his grandfather's, then his father's, and for the last 16 years, his own. He pressed the small catch. The lid sprang open on its hinge. Inside, the second hand moved patiently along its narrow arc, exactly as it had been. Moving on the afternoon, Vittorio Moretti had been shot at the red light on Roosevelt Avenue. Alessandro had wound it that morning, out of habit. He had not looked at it since. He looked at it now. He heard his father's voice, quiet and precise, as if the old man were standing at his shoulder. "Surrender is how the weak dig their own graves." Vittorio had said it to him once, in a warehouse office on a January night, when Alessandro had been 19 years old and had suggested, out of a young man's arrogance, that a certain rival might be paid off rather than confronted. His father had not raised his voice. He had simply said the sentence, And then he had said it again, and then he had gone back to his ledger. Alessandro closed the watch. He put it back in his pocket. He walked to the study door and opened it. The corridor outside was empty except for Sal, standing at the far end with his hat in his hand, waiting for instructions. Alessandro beckoned him closer with 2 fingers. Sal. His voice was low. 5 men. Only 5. The ones who took bullets with me in Newark 10 years ago. The ones who buried my mother's cousin without saying a word to anyone afterward. You know exactly who I mean. Yes, sir. Bring them to the wine cellar. Not the basement office. The cellar. 10 minutes. No one else on this floor at that hour. No one. Sal was already turning. He paused. Boss. Who else do we want present? Alessandro looked past him, down the corridor, toward the front of the house, toward the small pool of lamplight in the hall, where a silver-haired man in a dark waistcoat was, at this hour, folding a linen napkin with slow, meticulous hands. No one else, Alessandro said. Especially not Bernie. Sal understood without needing to ask. He inclined his head, and he was gone. The wine cellar of the Moretti estate lay 2 floors below the main house, at the end of a stone corridor that had been dug when the property was still a Prohibition-era country estate. It had 1 entrance. It had no windows. It was one of the very few rooms in the house whose key had never been copied for the domestic staff. Bernard Halloran, in 20 years of service, had never once been permitted inside. At 3 a.m, one of 5 men and Alessandro Moretti stood around the long oak tasting table in the center of that room. They were the men Alessandro had named to Sal in the corridor an hour earlier. Sal himself, 2 brothers named Vincenzo and Aldo, who had walked out of a burning warehouse in Newark 10 years ago with Alessandro between them, 1 under each arm. A quiet man named Renzo, who had once carried a dying cousin of the Moretti matriarch out of a hospital by a back stairwell without ever telling another living soul the man had been there. And Tommy the driver who had taken Emily to the village on the afternoon Noah had disappeared, and who had not slept since. 6 men. No coffee. No papers on the table. Only a single laptop, open and turned inward, its screen showing an overhead satellite view of a stretch of waterfront in Red Hook, Brooklyn. Alessandro placed 1 finger on a warehouse near the southern end of the pier complex. Warehouse 7, he said quietly. Bianchi's people took possession of it 18 months ago through a paper company. The scouts I sent out at midnight confirmed heat signatures on the interior thermal 6 adults on the ground floor. 1 small figure in a room at the back of the building. That small figure is my son. No one spoke. He moved his finger. The main gate is on the water side. Here. We come in loud from the water side. Sal, Vincenzo, Aldo. 2 boats. You come in fast. You make it sound like 10 men. You draw every man in that building toward the front. He moved his finger again. The side door, here, opens onto the alley off Van Brunt Street. It is a fire exit. It has not been welded shut because they want to be able to move him. Renzo, Tommy, and I go in that door in the 2nd minute. We reach the back room. We come out the same way. If we are not out by the 4th minute, we are not coming out at all. He looked up. No one on this team calls this in. No one on this team tells anyone in the house we are leaving. Not tonight. Not to a wife, not to a brother, not to a priest. When we come back, however we come back through the service gate at 4 a.m, and Bernie does not know we ever left. Every man at the table nodded once. He closed the laptop. Get the vehicles ready. Load quietly. Meet me at the service gate at 4. They filed out. He climbed the stairs alone. Emily was awake in the bedroom she and Noah shared. She was sitting on the edge of the bed in a plain sweater, her hands folded in her lap, her face composed in the way a woman's face becomes composed when she has decided she is not going to fall apart until someone gives her permission. Alessandro sat down beside her. I need you to stay downstairs until I come back, he said. In the room off the wine cellar. There is a bed, there is food, there is a bathroom. 2 of my men I would trust with my own life will be at the door. You do not open it for anyone else. Not for the housekeeper. Not for Bernie. Not even if you hear my voice on the other side. Unless you also hear Sal's voice with mine. Do you understand? She nodded. I'm going to bring him home, Emily. She did not ask him to promise. She had lived long enough by now to know what a promise from a man like Alessandro Moretti cost, and what it could not cost. She reached out and took his hand instead. She held it, hard, between both of her own. Bring my son back, she said. He did not answer with words. He leaned in and pressed his mouth, very lightly, against her forehead, the first time in the 4 years since he had left a folded stack of bills on a nightstand in Hell's Kitchen, and walked away without looking back. She closed her eyes. He rose. He did not look at her again. He walked out of the room, down the corridor, and down the stairs, and by 3:40 in the morning, Bernie Halloran standing at the small window at the far end of the second-floor landing, exactly the way he had stood at that window. Every night for 2 decades, saw the low silver profile of the Bentley move down the drive with the headlights off. And behind it 3 darkened SUVs, and behind them the 2 panel vans that had been quietly loaded in the service bay. Bernie watched the convoy reach the service gate. He watched it slip through and turn west toward the parkway. He watched until the last taillight had disappeared into the winter dark. Then he stepped back from the window, drew a small burner phone from the inside pocket of his waistcoat, and typed 4 words with the calm, deliberate care of a man who had been waiting 6 years for the opportunity to type them. He has gone. Now. He pressed send. He put the phone back in his pocket. He straightened the runner on the landing table, exactly the way he had straightened it every night for 20 years, and he went quietly down the back stairs to make sure the front hall was in order for whoever might arrive at the house next. 2 in the morning, fog lay thick over the Red Hook waterfront. It came in low off the harbor and pooled between the containers stacked along the pier, and where it thinned near the sodium lamps it turned the air into a yellow haze that smelled of salt and diesel and the cold iron of ships. The wet asphalt gave back nothing. The gulls were quiet at this hour. Even the traffic on the Gowanus, half a mile inland, felt distant and unreal. At 2:03, Sal's boat came in hot. He rammed the small skiff against the seaward pilings of Warehouse 7 and opened up with 2 automatic rifles across the loading bay before the hull had stopped moving. Vincenzo, from the second boat, put 3 rounds through the security floodlight on the north corner and killed the light entirely. Aldo was already ashore, laying down, covering fire toward the front doors. Inside the warehouse, an alarm began to howl. Voices shouted in Italian and English. The doors of Warehouse 7 burst open, and the 6 men Bianchi had left inside came out in a scattered, disorganized line, firing into the fog toward a noise they could not accurately place. Every single one of them was moving toward the water, which meant every single one of them was moving away from the alley. At 2:04, on the Van Brunt Street side, a plain black door in a plain brick wall opened from the outside. Alessandro Moretti went through it first. He held his father's Colt in a 2-handed grip low across his chest, muzzle down. Behind him came Renzo. Behind Renzo came Tommy. The 3 men moved along the inner corridor of the warehouse in a tight, silent stack, the way they had rehearsed in the wine cellar an hour before, the way Alessandro had rehearsed a dozen times in his life for rooms exactly like this one. 2 guards were coming down the corridor toward the sound of the fight at the front. They were looking the wrong way. Alessandro dropped the first one with a single round through the base of the skull. Renzo took the second before the body had reached the floor. They stepped over them. A 3rd man rounded the corner ahead, a big man with a shotgun already raised, and Alessandro shot him twice in the chest at 4 meters. The shotgun clattered on concrete. The corridor was quiet again, except for the muffled crack of gunfire from the pier side and, somewhere above them, a fire alarm that no one had thought to disable. The corridor ended at a heavy steel door with a small square window. Alessandro reached it, gestured Renzo and Tommy to fan out along the wall on either side, and looked once through the window. The room beyond was small and low-ceilinged. A single bare bulb hung on a chain from the concrete overhead. Against the back wall stood a wooden chair. On the wooden chair sat a very small figure, bound at wrists and ankles with plastic ties, a strip of black cloth tied across the eyes, and a folded handkerchief pushed into the mouth. The small chest under the striped pajama shirt rose and fell in short, shallow breaths. Alessandro's finger flexed once on the trigger guard, and then unflexed. He stepped back and drove his shoulder into the door. The frame gave on the second impact. He crossed the concrete floor in 4 strides and dropped to his knees in front of the chair. He set the Colt down on the floor at his side without taking his eyes off his son. His hands, which had held that weapon steady for the last 4 minutes, were suddenly shaking too badly to be trusted anywhere near a small face. He reached up and, very carefully, worked the knot of the blindfold loose at the back of the boy's head. The black cloth fell away. Noah's eyes opened, focused, adjusted, and found him. For half a second, the boy did not react. He was 3 years old and he had been in the dark for 2 days, and the shape kneeling in front of him did not, at first, resolve into anything he recognized. Then it did. His small mouth was still stopped with the handkerchief. He could not cry out, but his whole small body began to shake with a sob that had nowhere to go, and his eyes filled and overflowed, and the tears ran silently down his face while he made small, choked sounds against the cloth in his mouth. "I've got you," Alessandro said. His own voice was not steady. "I'm here. I've got you." He eased the handkerchief out of his son's mouth first. Noah gulped in one open, ragged breath and then another, but he still did not cry out. He only kept his eyes fixed on Alessandro's face, as though he were afraid that if he looked away, the face would not be there when he looked back. Alessandro drew a small folding knife from his coat and began, very carefully, to cut the tie at the boy's right wrist. Behind him, at the doorway to the small room, the ruined steel door hung crookedly on one hinge. The door moved, very softly, not with the violence of an intruder, but with the practiced quiet of a man who had spent his entire adult life opening doors in this house and that one without making them creak. A figure stepped into the room. He was not one of Bianchi's men. He wore no coat. His silver hair was neat. His dark waistcoat was buttoned. His face was the face Alessandro Moretti had trusted for 20 years. The face that had refilled his coffee cup twice a day. The face that had folded napkins in his mother's dining room when Alessandro was a boy. Bernard Halloran raised a service pistol in his right hand. The safety was already off. The muzzle was already trained on the back of Alessandro Moretti's neck. Bernard Halloran pulled the trigger. In the same fraction of a second before the round could complete its short, straight flight across the room, a second figure came through the wrecked doorway behind him. He did not come the way an old man had come. He came at a full, ragged sprint, low and shoulder first, the way a man comes across a room when he has understood, before the trigger has finished traveling, that a bullet is already in the air, and there is exactly one thing in the world he can do about it. He hit Alessandro across the ribs and drove him sideways off his knees. The round meant for the back of Alessandro Moretti's neck struck the side of the newcomer's shoulder instead. It did not go through. It carved a long, bright furrow along the outer deltoid and lodged in the muscle. The impact spun him a half step. He caught himself with one hand flat on the concrete floor, and by then his other hand was already coming up with a pistol drawn from the waistband at his hip. He did not raise the weapon to his eye. There was no time. He fired once from the hip, at a range of 4 meters, in the moment before Bernie could bring the service pistol back into line. The round hit the old butler in the center of the chest. Bernard Halloran did not, at first, fall. He took a half step backward. He looked down at the front of his dark waistcoat, at the small, neat perforation, at the slow, dark bloom that was beginning under the wool. He looked up again, and his mouth moved. He was trying to say a name. He was trying, with the last function of a mouth that had for 20 years pronounced other people's names with perfect diction, to give up the name of the man he had served for the last 6. No sound came. His legs went. He sat down heavily against the wall beside the doorframe, and his eyes stayed open, and his lips continued for one more second to shape a syllable that no one in that room would ever hear. Then he was still. Alessandro pushed himself up onto one knee. His ears were ringing. He turned. The man who had just taken a bullet in his place was already climbing back to his feet, using the wall for support with his uninjured arm. The pistol had gone back into the waistband. He was pale, the kind of pale that came from 6 weeks of not enough sleep and not enough food and a wound in the abdomen that had not yet fully healed. There was dried blood down the front of his shirt from an older injury that had reopened. The bandage under it was gray with river salt. His eyes were sunken, and they were the color they had always been, and they were absolutely awake. Marco Bellini looked past Alessandro at the body against the wall. "I have been looking for you for 6 weeks, Bernie," he said, quietly, almost gently. Alessandro rose the rest of the way to his feet and caught his friend by the good arm as he swayed. He held him upright. He could not, for a full breath, speak. He had walked away from a cliff 4 nights ago believing that he had murdered his brother. He had carried the weight of that belief up a flight of stone stairs, through a front hall, past a woman who had not asked, into a study that had felt afterward like the inside of a coffin. He had lived 4 days as a man who had done that. And here, in the yellow light of a bare bulb in Warehouse 7, was Marco Bellini, thin, bleeding, standing looking at him with the eyes of a man who had never for one moment considered not walking back. Some apologies cannot be spoken in words. They can only be spoken by blood flowing in the right direction. Marco reached inside the pocket of his ruined coat with his good hand and drew something out. He pressed it into Alessandro's palm. It was not the silver cross. That one was still in the top drawer of Bernie's service cabinet, at the estate, where the old man had left it. This was smaller and rougher, a small crucifix carved out of a piece of driftwood, no bigger than the joint of a thumb, the surface still ridged from the blade of the pocket knife that had made it. It smelled faintly of salt and pine. "You keep the silver one," Marco said. His voice was rough now, exhaustion pushing up through it. "This one is to remind us. Some things do not need to be proven." Alessandro closed his fingers around the small wooden cross. Behind him, from the wooden chair in the center of the room, came the soft sound of a small body sliding down out of a chair whose remaining bindings Alessandro had, in the shock of the last 30 seconds, forgotten to finish cutting. Noah had gotten his own hands free. He crossed the concrete floor on unsteady legs. He did not look at the body against the wall. He did not look at Marco. He came around the front of Alessandro on his uneven small legs, and he wrapped both arms around his father's calf, and he pressed his whole small face into the black wool of the coat, and he did not let go. Alessandro looked down at the top of his son's blonde head. He looked at the man leaning against the wall beside him with a bandage darkening under a torn shirt. He looked at the small wooden cross in his own closed hand, and, for a long moment, in a room that still smelled of cordite and salt and the last breath of a traitor, Alessandro Moretti did not move, because there was nothing left in this world that mattered more than staying exactly where he was, exactly as he was. For one more second, Alessandro lifted Noah into his arm. He kept the small body pressed against his chest, and with his free hand he took Marco's good elbow, and the three of them moved out of the small room together, one wounded man, one man carrying his son, and a boy who did not once loosen his hold on his father's collar. Renzo met them in the corridor with news. The Moretti crew had understood, the moment Bernie Halloran had walked in through the alley door behind their boss, that the ambush ran in two directions. Sal had turned every man he had against the fog and against the shipping containers. The fight for the pier was no longer for the boy. It was for the trap laid inside it. Aldo and Tommy took Noah and Marco toward the alley door and the vehicles beyond. Alessandro turned back toward the pier. The battle in the fog was not long. It was ugly. It ran along the pilings and around the stacked containers and out onto the wet planking of the pier itself, and the smell of cordite hung in the salt air until the salt air itself seemed made of it. Salvatore Bianchi ran. He came out of the warehouse's north exit at a hard sprint for the black SUV his driver had left idling at the end of the pier. He almost reached it. He was fumbling with the passenger door handle when a second vehicle, a Moretti panel van that Marco had, in the last 4 minutes and with one working arm, positioned across the far end of the pier, cut off the escape route entirely. Bianchi turned. He did not raise his weapon, because he was smarter than that. He raised his hands. Alessandro walked out of the fog toward him, with the Colt still in his hand. He did not raise it either. He walked the length of the pier at an ordinary man's pace, and when he stopped 4 steps in front of Salvatore Bianchi, close enough to speak without raising his voice. "You laid a good trap," he said. Bianchi said nothing. "But you did not understand the room you were laying it in." Alessandro tilted his head, once, the way his father used to. "Marco Bellini is not my right hand, Salvatore. Marco Bellini is my brother." Then he raised the Colt. Salvatore Bianchi did not have time to smile again. Dawn came somewhere over the Verrazzano while they were driving north. The Bentley crossed the bridge with Noah asleep across Alessandro's lap in the back seat, one small hand still closed around the black lapel of his father's coat. In the front passenger seat, Marco sat with his shoulder rebandaged by Tommy at a rest stop and his eyes closed, though he was not sleeping. They were somewhere on the parkway, just past the exit for Great Neck, when Marco spoke without opening his eyes. "You should know where I was." Alessandro did not answer at once. "On Saturday afternoon, when Noah was taken, you do not have to tell me anymore. I want to." He opened his eyes and looked out at the paling sky. Brooklyn, Greenwood, Section 14, Plot 273. My father's grave. It was his anniversary. Alessandro sat very still. "He died on that day 22 years ago, Marco said, quietly, still looking at the road. "You were 19. Your father was 38. 2 men came through the door at the back of the meat market off Court Street with a shotgun each. My father was standing between them and yours. Your father lived. Mine did not. I remember. I know you remember. That is why I never told you the date." Marco turned his head then, slowly, and looked at his friend across the leather. "Every year I went alone. I did not tell you because you had enough anniversaries in your life without carrying mine on top of them. I did not tell you this year because I thought I would be back in the house by dinner and no one would need to know." He paused. "It was the one place on earth that day where I could not have proven where I was to save my life, because there was no one there but me." Alessandro turned his face toward the window. He did not answer. He did not, for a long moment, trust himself to. 3 days later, at 7 in the evening, every senior member of the Moretti organization walked into the great dining hall on the ground floor of the estate. They filled the room. They did not know what the meeting was for. There were no maps on the table, no ledgers, no chairs arranged for negotiation. There was only Alessandro Moretti, in a plain black suit without a tie, standing at the head of the long room, and, 4 steps to his right, Marco Bellini, one arm still in a sling. Alessandro spoke without notes. He spoke about the last 3 weeks. He spoke about a fingerprint on a windowsill and a fingerprint that had never been placed there by the hand it belonged to. He spoke about a cliff on the north shore of Long Island. He spoke about a bullet in a warehouse in Red Hook that had gone into the wrong shoulder, and about the man who had taken it. Then he walked to the center of the room, and, in front of every man who worked for him, he lowered himself onto one knee. Marco came forward before he had finished the motion. He put his good hand under Alessandro's elbow and drew him back to his feet. "Get up," Marco said quietly, so the whole room could hear. "The only man who kneels in this house is the traitor, and he is already dead." The dining hall was silent. And then, slowly, one by one, the men in that room began to applaud. 1 year later, on the first mild morning of spring, 4 figures stepped into the main concourse of Grand Central Terminal. The sun came down in soft golden shafts through the great arched windows, laying long, patient rectangles of light across the marble floor. The concourse was full of the ordinary morning hurry. In the middle of it all, a small blond boy in a navy blue coat held tightly to his father's hand. Noah had grown. He was 4 years old now. His steps were steadier. In his free arm he carried the same worn gray teddy bear he had held on a bench in this room the winter before last. His mother walked at his other side, the plain gold ring on her left hand still new enough to catch the light. The small wedding in the estate garden had happened 2 months ago. There had been 11 people present, 1 priest, and a wooden arch built by Marco himself. Marco walked half a step behind them. His shoulder had healed. Around his neck hung 2 crosses now on the same chain, the old silver one his father had left him, and beside it a smaller one carved out of a piece of driftwood. They were on their way to catch the 10:08 to Brooklyn. They were going to visit Vittorio Moretti's grave. Afterward, for the first time in 22 years, Alessandro was going to walk with Marco 4 rows over, in section 14, to the smaller headstone Marco had visited alone for 2 decades. Noah slowed. He had reached the middle of the concourse, near a long wooden bench that stood against the western wall. He stopped in front of it. He looked up at his father. "Daddy," he said, "this is where Uncle Alex found me, right?" Alessandro went down slowly onto one knee, right there on the marble, so that his eyes were level with his son's. "No, Noah," he said quietly, "this is where you found me." Noah looked at the bench. Then he held the teddy bear out toward his father with both small hands. "You keep him for me, Daddy. You keep promises." Alessandro took the bear with both hands. He did not trust himself to speak. Somewhere back at the estate, above the fireplace in the library, a small paper note in a plain black frame hung beside the oil portrait of Vittorio Moretti. Somewhere back at the estate, the great iron gate at the end of the drive stood open, as it had stood open every day since the morning Noah had come home. And somewhere in an office in Manhattan, the older lines of the Moretti business were quietly closing. Alessandro had not built a new empire out of the ashes of the old one. He had chosen, instead, to build a smaller life. The 10:08 to Brooklyn began to board. Alessandro rose to his feet with the gray bear still cradled in his hands. Noah took his mother's hand on one side and reached, of his own accord, for Marco's on the other. The 4 of them walked together toward the eastern platform, and the golden light through the great arched windows fell across their backs. "Dear friend, thank you for staying with this story until the very last moment. We would love to hear from you. Have you ever been forced to choose between the evidence in front of your eyes and the trust you carried in your heart? Did you choose right, or did you learn, too late, that you had chosen wrong? Was there a Marco in your life you almost lost? Was there a Noah in your life who found you before you knew you were still looking? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Every honest word you send matters, and some of the most beautiful lessons on this channel come from the hearts of those who choose to write back. If this journey moved you, please take a moment to give it a like. Subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next story. Share this video with someone you love, someone who might, tonight, need to be reminded that trust and second chances and the courage to stop for a stranger are still some of the most powerful forces in this world. From all of us, we wish you good health, a peaceful heart, and gentle days ahead. May the people you love come home to you. May the doors that were closed too long be opened again. Take care of yourselves, and take care of one another. We will see you very soon, in the next story.